Good evening, everybody. Hopefully things are streaming okay. Tonight, welcome, sorry, should have said welcome to the Upset in Concrete podcast. And tonight we have Joe Morgan with us. Joe, could I ask you just to introduce yourself briefly, please?
Sure. Thanks, Grant. Good to see you this fine Sunday evening. So yeah, my name is Joe Morgan, as it says on screen, and I'm primarily an impacted defective concrete homeowner, and I've been involved in the campaign for justice, if you like, in terms of 100% redress for a number of years now.
Great, and Joe's you've been particularly heading up the kind of one of the European angles or a couple of angles in Europe over this defective concrete issue. Sorry, I forgot to say the aim of this podcast is to discuss maybe in a little bit more detail specific topics related to the concrete crisis. At the moment, it's a bit sporadic, but as my skills improve, hopefully it'll become a more regular weekly thing. And just before we dive in, I just wanted to say that we want to be we want to participate in responsible communication. So we should try and ensure our statements are accurate. We should make clear when we're talking about facts and when we're talking about our own opinions. We should be respectful in our statements, and we should correct each other's mistakes. Hopefully we won't make them, and but we should correct things as soon as possible, immediately on air. If we do something, make a mistake on air. So tonight we're going to first of all watch a 15-minute summary video of how homeowners have taken the defective concrete crisis to Europe. We'll then ask Joe about his experience of meeting the European Union Petitions Committee when they came to visit Donegal in October last year. And then we're going to be looking specifically at market surveillance issues that arose in the EU Petitions Committee report. And just to note, market surveillance is basically, ensuring that products placed on the market comply with the relevant legislation and standards to protect consumers, businesses, and the environment. But Joe will be helping us out in more detail with that. Also, just to note that the Petitions Committee in Europe is known as the PETI Committee, P-E-T-I. They have a lot of four-letter acronyms over there. Okay, so before we speak to Joe, I'm just going to play this short 15-minute video outlining how homeowners have taken the defective concrete crisis to the European Union. Okay, so here's the video. Joe, how the European Union angle started.
So when we were all in Dublin marching, protesting against what we felt was an unworkable scheme in October 2021, MEP Luke Ming Flanagan actually approached two of the campaigners, happened to be Dr. Eileen Doherty and Miss Anna Owens, and he offered support to help. We lodged 8 petitions in total, and 7 of those were individual family accounts of their own experiences with living in a defective home. And then I put together what we were calling our primary petition.
Immediately after Joe and Anne gave their presentations, a senior policy assistant at DG Grow gave the Commission's response. This was by Mr. Manfred Fuchs. Now, DG Grow is the section of the European Commission that, and I quote from their website, is responsible for the internal market, industry, entrepreneurship, and SMEs.
The member states are responsible for the market surveillance, meaning checking the performance of the products being placed on the market. But I have to admit, despite all this long and very interesting information that has been already provided on these issues, that in reality, we are talking here for the time being for a national issue, not so much a European issue. What we can do, since there was also a reference here to the reference to the possibility to avoid that something like this is happening in future.
After Mr. Fuchs spoke, Members of the European Parliament gave their contributions. Note that sometimes you'll hear the translator speaking instead of the actual speaker, so it might look a bit weird that you're hearing a man's voice when a woman is talking.
It's important that we protect the citizens.
I think we should write to the Irish government to see how they have dealt with EU laws.
But we can say that this is under subsidiarity, but if we got petition from this huge amount of citizens, we have to deal with this.
Subsidiarity is a fundamental principle that determines the level at which decisions should be made, meaning that the European Union should only take action if objectives cannot be sufficiently achieved by member states at the central, regional or local levels.
And certainly, while there was a redress scheme announced by the government yesterday, I know that there's still some concerns about it, but I think it is, in effect, an effort to try and resolve some of the issues, or most of the issues. And clearly there is still some outstanding areas.
The member state is not doing what it needs to do, so someone is going to have to represent these people and do the right thing. And finally, the offer that was made yesterday by the Irish government for an average house, and this was what they wanted people to accept, will leave €73,000 of a bill for people in an average house. You are driving these people to despair.
One has to wonder if Minister O'Brien's Department of Housing released the so-called enhanced new scheme the day before the homeowners presented their petitions in Europe, whether that was a coincidence or a plan to try and discredit the homeowners in their petition to Europe.
This mica and pyrite issue is the legacy of the light touch regulation that came into effect during the relentless house building years of the Celtic Tigers. Now it's obvious with the scale of what we're talking about, it cannot be done by the producer of the materials concerned. So the buck has to stop somewhere, and I'm glad to see that our colleagues here are willing to leave the petition open.
One of the petitioners quite rightly said that we don't want to be here in 15 years' time to be talking about the same kind of thing.
There are two issues where I am concerned in relation to accountability. One is the insurance companies must not be left off the hook here, and two, those charged with regulating the material used in buildings, somebody slipped up very badly. Now, I was pleased that the government yesterday announced a scheme which commits €2.2 billion to help them to redress the situation and rebuild their houses, up to a maximum of €420,000 per house. Now, that's not little money by any means.
Mr. Kelly seems to be unaware that homeowners will only get a grant for the value of construction products that were available prior to 2008.
There has been some improvements, but not to the standard of what families and businesses are deserving.
There are actually no provisions for businesses at all in the new enhanced scheme.
There was a lot of pushback from the MEPs back to the EU Commission to state, there's an issue here. Legislation needs to be able to protect these citizens. It's not good enough to state that it's a member state issue only.
The Commission wrote a response the day after the petitions were presented before the Petitions Committee. The response basically said that this was a national issue. Next, I asked Paul Dunlop about his visit to Europe in March of 2022.
So we had some of the homeowner groups were there talking, and we also had a science delegation as well too. It was the sort of first time that we were trying to build a network of scientists who understood the problem more broadly than what was happening in Ireland. But it was clear that there were other things happening in people's homes as well too, particularly in Donegal, where engineer reports are coming back reporting high levels of the very highly reactive iron sulfide mineral. We wanted to try and see, could we use that event to develop a research network of academic researchers and professional practitioners who could just develop a research strategy to investigate deleterious minerals in concrete in Ireland, which has been successful. We now have a group of people who came over to the conference in November, which was another EU left sponsored group event.
To see a speaker-by-speaker index to the full day's video of the conference that took place in Letterkenny last year in November, please type in backstory.ie/conference into your browser.
And that group are now working on a €500,000 project for Geological Survey of Ireland. So that was the sort of first attempt to try and broaden the sort of scientific understanding at a European level that there was more than mica happening in the concrete.
On the 1st of June 2023, homeowners visited Europe again. I asked Joe Morgan if this visit was different to the previous ones.
Very different this time, Grant. So ultimately, our initial jaunt, if you can call it that, in the EU Parliament, that had kind of come to an end because when the Petty Committee had referred our case to the internal committees of the EU Parliament, ITRA and IMCO were the two that were referenced, they didn't decide that they were going to take it any further. Ultimately, in order to escalate the case, it has to get to the EU Commission. And I've been emailing MEPs for over a year and a half, but was not having too much success, if I'm being honest, up until Paul and Andreas published their scientific report on the concrete blocks in Donegal. So Paul, Andreas, myself, Dr. Eileen Doherty, and Lisa Holm, chairperson of MAG, went over last week. So that meeting was with the EU Commission themselves, with Manfred Fuchs. And the idea there, Grant, was twofold. One, it was to provide and present evidence that we have today, but two, it was to learn ourselves as to what we need to do next in order that the EU Commission would take our case up. So our next step in terms of engaging the EU Commission internal processes is to lodge a formal complaint with them. And we want them to infringe our government for not following the directives, and to then make sure for future generations that market surveillance is actually followed. Once we submit that complaint, it should, at a minimum, generate engagement between the EU Commission and our government, right? And if you like, that should apply political pressure. Ultimately, this is less likely, but if it depends. I think one in Spain was probably favoured to get the vote within the Petty Committee hearing earlier this year, but the Donegal case won. So we have the Petty Committee coming over to Donegal.
Paul Dunlop then chaired the rest of the meeting, which was about the science around defective concrete.
I mean, as Joe was saying, the meeting came about because they wanted to talk to us about the science in the paper that was published. So we effectively give them a short presentation overview of the paper that we published in Cement and Concrete Research in March, but concrete also failing standards more recently in 2022. So, I mean, they were very, very surprised that was still happening, you know. And they also were very aware of the government's report in 2017 and how that alluded to mica, you know, and there was a bit of a head shaking involved in that as well too from them.
Here is Backstory.ie's experience of what took place at the press conference for the EU mission to Donegal, which came to investigate the defective concrete crisis. We'd been told by the EU press officers that the format of the press conference would be that only the petitions chair, Dolores Montserrat, would be speaking.
The past 3 days, we have visited Ireland to follow up on the several petitions received by the Committee on Petitions of the European Parliament on the use of defective blocks used in construction, the alleged non-compliance with the European Union Construction Products Regulation, and the protection of home owners. In order to acquire deep knowledge of all related aspects, we had reached an intensive meetings with the petitioners, the national and regional authorities, as well as with a wide range of campaign and activist groups, experts and representatives in academia.
What concerns are you hearing from homeowners regarding the current redress scheme?
First of all, some of the owners, they were well, the word is not happy, but I don't have now English word to explain that. They were more comfortable with this second plan because the first plan was 90% to 10%. So the 90% it was a state plan, and the 10% they had to put their own money. And now this second plan it is 100%. So this means that the state, the state plan, it's giving to them the 100%. So we have to improve this plan.
Ms. Montserrat, many of the homeowners that I've spoken to would say that it's not a 100% scheme, but the state says it's 100%, but homeowners are expected to build to 2007 building regulations. So it's also an issue that they will be breaching current building regs if they use 2008 materials, but perhaps you can't even buy those materials today. That's one issue, but it's kind of complicated to kind of talk about here maybe, but what I wanted to ask you was the petition, the report that you write, how do you see that being used in the European Union to improve market surveillance going forward across Ireland and in Europe? And secondly, can this report be used in any way to help homeowners get true 100% redress?
In these 3 past days, we were discussing about the foundations, because the 100% now it's not including the foundations of the house. But it is true that the foundation, it is not made by Pirita, it's made by concrete.
When I told Ms. Montserrat that the homeowners I've spoken to don't regard the new scheme as a 100% scheme, she did come out and at least mention the exclusion of foundations. So that got put on the record and somewhat qualified the idea that it is not a 100% scheme. This hopefully helped sway journalists to the view that the scheme really is not a 100% redress scheme. It turned out that after the press conference, the MEPs stayed for a while and journalists were able to individually ask questions of the other MEPs. I got to speak with Luke Ming Flanagan. Luke told me that Ms. Montserrat was actually very well aware of the situation and that this faux pas was due to meaning being lost in translation between Spanish and English. In a letter Backstory.ie received from the Director General of DG Grow, Kirsten Jorna, it stated, and I quote, "Without preempting any future decisions to act, the Commission stated that it would become active against the Irish authorities if it was proven that they were still not ensuring sufficiently effective control of products being placed on the Irish market." Right, that was the live stream. Oh, Joe, you're there. I was a bit worried I'd lost
Still here,
you.
Grant.
Oh, great. Okay. No worries. Sorry, just let me get this sorted. Okay. Okay. So just before we go into the to discuss the report, is just a few things about the report I'd like to highlight. And this is the there were a few typos and errors that were a bit disappointing in the report. For example, floodplain was spelt like aeroplane instead of PLAIN. As an example of one of the errors, there was another time when Mr. Hegarty was referred to, but it was actually Martina Hegarty, so it would have been Miss Hegarty. And then there was just an example of a kind of error was they found the deleterious material in County Donegal primarily to be muscovite mica, while in County Mayo it was primarily reactive pyrite, which led to poor freeze-thaw resistance. This seems to gloss over the fact that the report of the expert panel on concrete blocks from June 2017 describes the suspected internal sulfate attack in concrete blocks from Mayo on page 44 and 45. So, it was kind of inaccurate to say that reactive pyrite led to poor freeze-thaw resistance. The internal sulfate attack was kind of glossed over. Another example of an error is the following, which was attributed to the minister. Quote, the minister gave an overview of the new enhanced scheme, listing the main improvements such as the increase of the maximum grant to 400,000 euros. Now, it's unlikely the minister would have substituted 400,000 for 420,000. Now, it could be that these apparent errors are due to someone who is not a native English speaker, that may have been writing the reports in English, which is not their native language. However, one would have thought that with the EU and all its translators, that they would have released a more accurate document. But anyway, be that as it may. So first of all, just so the Joe and went to Europe in December 2021. Paul went to Europe in the following March in 2022 with some homeowners, including some from homeowners from Mayo, Julie Tracy, and some concrete experts, including Debbie McCoy and Andres Lehman and others. So that happened in March, and then the Petitions Committee came to Ireland in October 2023. So first of all, Joe, just to say that when the Petitions Committee came, they met with petitioners, they met with representatives of action groups from Donegal, Mayo, and Clare. They did an inspection of several homes and a childcare facility. They had a meeting with representatives of Donegal County Council. They had a meeting with a number of experts, and they had meetings with representatives from the Department of Housing. So these are outlined briefly in the report. But Joe, you were actually at the meeting with the petitioners. Obviously, you were the lead petitioner there. Could you tell us something about, how was that meeting? Kind of what happened, if you just describe it. What was the, did you feel you had a good, they understood, were they asking the right questions? Just leave it open to you to describe the meeting.
Yeah, thanks, Grant. So yeah, I think the meeting, that particular meeting, because that was the only one that I was actually present for. I personally thought it was very powerful, because it was the petitioners who had put in the original petitions to the EU Parliament that were present at it, along with the delegation, obviously, from the EU. So, as I stated as part of that presentation to the EU Parliament, 6 of the 7 petitions that we submitted were personal family accounts of living with defective concrete. So there was a very real, honest, and quite emotional readout from those individuals, telling very personal stories of, health problems alongside living in a defective property and impact that was having on their own lives, relationships, kids, etc. So there was a very emotional aspect to that particular meeting, and Dolores Montserrat, I would say in particular, was very much touched by it. I think she understood the despair in a lot of cases that those individuals were going through. So I think that message very much got across, and that was primarily the objective. Was just to paint that picture in terms of the impact it was having on families. The petition that I submitted was not, myself and my wife submitted petitions, right? And my wife kind of covered her own personal circumstances. The petition that I'd submitted was more technical, if you like, and anchored into EU regulation, and that was the subject matter that I was keen to get across. So when I was asked for my own contribution, I spoke more to market surveillance, lack of, I should say, and the impact that was having in terms of the introduction of defective concrete blocks into the marketplace. But at that time, what we thought was Donegal and Mayo, but we now know was a nationwide issue.
And Joe, so could I ask you, what is market surveillance? Could you tell us, how the National Market Surveillance Office, and can you tell us about the National Market Surveillance Office, and also about the market surveillance activities that come under the remit of the local authorities or councils, and how do they work together?
Yeah, so I can give you my level of understanding, Grant, but I want to make it clear I'm a long way from an expert. But ultimately, market surveillance authority, i.e., ensuring that products, all products that are introduced into the marketplace within the EU are fit for purpose. That's effectively what market surveillance is about. And market surveillance authority, which is the ownership and responsibility of making sure that that happens, is delegated from the EU through regulation to, in the case of Ireland, the Department of Housing. Right now, the Department of Housing then, in turn,
Sorry, Joe.
delegate.
Can I just, Joe? Sorry,
Go ahead.
my string just conked out there for a while. Would you mind
Okay.
going back to? Would you mind starting that answer again, if you don't mind?
Yeah, can do. So market surveillance is effectively about ensuring that products that are introduced into the market, in our case Ireland, right, that are introduced into the marketplace, that they're fit for purpose. At a very broad sense, that's what it is about, right? And the authority or responsibility of ensuring that is delegated from the EU through regulation, and in the case of Ireland, to the Department of Housing, right, for concrete blocks or concrete products in general, actually. Now, the Department of Housing have in turn delegated that responsibility out, or have historically delegated that responsibility out to local authorities. So, in my own case, Donegal County Council, and that is the case across the country. Market surveillance authority is delegated to the various different local authorities, and in terms of what that means, yeah, and there's been a lot of commentary in terms of the recent committee hearings, both in housing and finance of late, in terms of who's responsible for what, right? And the manufacturer's responsible for making sure the products are fit for purpose, and that's not the job of market surveillance, etc. So my opinion on this, and it's somewhat informed, right? But there is accuracy in the statement that, from a market surveillance perspective, the economic operator, which is the quarry and the block manufacturer, right, it is their responsibility to ensure that products are fit for purpose, right? But as was stated by one of the civil servants in the Department of Housing committee hearing, the Department of Housing have oversight responsibility, right, for market surveillance. So whilst they are not responsible for making sure that the products are fit for purpose that are entering the marketplace, they are responsible for overseeing that they are, right? And in order to do that, in the case of concrete blocks, they need to have verification and validation from the economic operators that those blocks are fit for purpose. And the way that you get that, it's not through checking EC marks on concrete block bales. It's by testing the quarries. And in actual fact, if you look at EU regulation, it specifically states that regular assessment of quarries should be carried out. And that is not happening in Ireland, and I would argue it's not happening today. Now, we did have, obviously, the big audit of 2022, and look, we have to welcome that. But that's a one-off exercise that was commissioned directly by the Minister for Housing himself, Darragh O'Brien, and that hasn't happened since. And I'm sure if the Department of Housing were out there involved in testing and making sure that they were fulfilling their own remit of market surveillance oversight, that we would hear about it, and we haven't. And that is the crux of the issue.
Do you think the concept that I have is correct? Like, so you have an economic operator, which is just the market surveillance fancy term for a block manufacturer quarry,
Yeah.
right? So a block comes off the quarry, and that block needs to get tested. Now, it seems to me that my understanding, I don't know this for sure, but my understanding is quarries don't have testing facilities. So they employ some outside company to test the block. But, the question I have is, how often is that done? But anyway, the block is tested and it's given a piece of paper called a declaration of performance. And then the engineer, when they get blocks and they have to certify something, they look at the declaration of performance, and that's what they base their decision on. That piece of paper says the block is sound, so they go with that. And then they rely on that certificate. And then it's kind of like a chain of reliance. Like, the insurance companies are relying on the engineer, and the engineer is relying on the declaration of performance. Is there any holes in that you can see, or any additions that need to be made?
In terms of your question, Grant, I can't answer whether or how regular the quarries are testing their own product. I don't know.
Yeah,
But
I don't know that either.
the declaration of performance, as I understand it, is not about testing the constitution of the block and whether that aligns with regulation or not. It's about ensuring that the manufacturing processes, so the processes that the economic operators are going through in terms of manufacture of the block, that they are aligned, right, and that they meet certain criteria. But all of these CE markings, as I understand it, there's no input into that in terms of testing the actual block. However, EU regulation states that regular testing has to happen, and indeed the report from the Petitions Committee mission to Ireland also stated that their recommendation to the Commission would be that Ireland would have regular assessment of quarries on at least an annual basis. I think that was the text that was in the document. So, and that needs to happen. If you've got unannounced, regular, third-party assessment of materials that are going into concrete products, that's how you start to get to a point where you can have confidence that those blocks are fit for purpose.
Because if you look, like, every company has to have their declaration of performance online, and it should be downloadable. So if you Google like Kilsaran DOP, you should find a bunch of different declaration of performances. And some of the specifications in the declaration of performance are simply the dimensions of the block. But then there's also, like, it has a specification for the Newton strength, for example. There's some reference to freeze thaw. When Ms. Mairead Phelan and Mr. Richard Butler from the Market Surveillance Office were before the Housing Committee, it was back a few years ago now, and Padre McLaughlin at that time was asking questions. And in the end of all, Mr. Butler said that the Market Surveillance Office only test the block according to what the Declaration of Performance says. And because there's no specifications in the Declaration of Performance for deleterious materials, they don't test for deleterious materials. That was something that happened back at that meeting. I don't know, it was a while back. You may not recall it.
That goes back to my point, Grant, that the oversight that Ms. Phelan was talking about, and indeed what the National Building Control Office is responsible for, and the local authorities, right, is to verify that those declaration of performances are in place. But look, that we know that those declaration of performances have been placed for decades, right? And yet we still have this crisis. So is there gaps there? Well, absolutely, because if everybody's telling us that declarations of performance were in good shape, they were available, and everything within them was correct, and yet we still have thousands of properties across the state which have got defective concrete in them, well, then there's a gap, right? And the gap is testing the constitutional components of the block. And look, nobody, I think, is aware whether that's happening or not. I mean, look, I would argue that it's not, because how else have we got ourselves into this situation? And EU regulation states it needs to happen regularly. And indeed, the report, as I just said, also recommends that it happens at least annually. And if you go back to Mairead Phelan, she's on record quite a few times in 2023. She was on prime time, and her office does not have the bandwidth or individually the technical expertise to go out and do those tests. And if you look at the audit of 2022, that was a multi-agency effort commissioned by the minister. Many different state agencies involved in making that happen. That needs to be the norm. That level of expertise across multiple different departments and state bodies, have to come together on a regular basis, and they have to hit all of the 200 plus quarries and pits that we have in the country if we are to have a level of confidence that the products that are being produced are fit for purpose.
One of the things I find a bit weird, do you remember there was a you know, the CPD, continuous professional development, you know, most professionals have to undergo some training during the course of a year to kind of keep their skills up, you know. And I attended a market surveillance office continuous professional development webinar, and it was delivered by Ms. Phelan, and she specifically said that the confidentiality of the economic operator is kind of paramount. And, you know, that was just interesting, because back in 2017, there was a lady called Deirdre Flynn who appeared before the Housing Committee, I think it was. Yeah, it was, because they were discussing the building regulation, BCAR, building, can't remember what it stands for, regulations, building regulations, building and control amendment regulations.
Building control regulations, I think it is, yeah.
And at that time, this lady who's from the legal, she's a barrister, and she was doing a PhD in construction law, and she said that you know, for food safety authority, you know, you can phone them up and they'll tell you this restaurant was closed because it had a rat problem. That restaurant was closed because it was, you know, needed big cleanup, and these things are public. So the way the market surveillance office operates is very different, you know, with this kind of secrecy thing. And then then it seems that the role of the market surveillance office is to go in and help that economic operator get their act together, and then they just keep trading again. But as far as the general public are concerned, they would have no insight as to what market surveillance, what economic operator, you know, had to be fixed by the market surveillance office. No, I thought that was kind of interesting.
Yeah, you actually just triggered another thought, Grant, and you make a good point. So market surveillance, as I've just described, in terms of, is very much a preventative exercise, right, to stop products that are not fit for purpose entering the marketplace, right? That's its primary objective. However, and there's again EU regulation that stipulates the response to a market surveillance activity. So rather than preventing it, whereby market surveillance is being executed and there is fault found, if you like. So in the case of the restaurant that you stated, you know, so if I'm guessing as an example, if there was rodents found on site, that establishment would be closed down, right? And there's very, very strict directives from the EU in terms of what happens in that event for defective concrete products as well. But if you go back to the audit of 2022, and I've heard, you know, commentary coming from, I think it's on record as well, whereby, you know, that all of the quarries that were audited were all compliant, right? But if you look at the auditor's report at the end of that exercise, Quarry B in that report was identified as having, and I quote, previously undeclared levels of pyrite. So what I don't understand is, right, so, you know, we've had, you know, all of these declarations of performance being reviewed by whoever over the years, and there's an audit carried out. In this case, it was in Donegal, and one of the quarries has a previously undisclosed level of a deleterious mineral, which is limited by EU regulation in terms of going into concrete blocks, and yet that is deemed to have been compliant. Interesting. I would have thought that was a fail.
Well, yeah, even we're getting off topic from the report. It's kind of partly my fault for deviating, but I'm going to bring the rather focus back to the report, and you know, it's my fault for kind of veering off it in the first place. But the report stated that an executive in Donegal County Council said, so this is a quote directly from the report, quote, "The council as a market surveillance authority does not have an obligation to certify compliance with standards and specifications, but to take enforcement measures when irregularities become apparent, stating that the responsibility for compliance rests with the manufacturers." So this, you know, we've kind of touched on this, and I think you've touched on it already in this live stream, but this suggests that the local authority is only reactive and there's no proactive market surveillance at the moment. And that's one of the recommendations at the end of the report, is that market surveillance needs to be proactive, but the council seems here to be saying that it's only reactive. Have you got any insights into the proactive and reactive? You know, what can you tell us? Maybe you're not okay. Maybe we don't know what is happening, but what is supposed to happen according to the European laws? Do we know that, or does it require investigation?
No, I mean, I would challenge that statement very, very strongly, actually. Market surveillance regulation is twofold, in that it prescribes preventative measures, right? So what you should be doing in terms of ongoing assessment to make sure that products are fit for purpose. But it also describes a response strategy, right? And these are in EU legal directives as well. So, like, the local authorities of this country are all delegated market surveillance oversight. They're not responsible. The manufacturer is responsible for ensuring that their products are fit for purpose, but local authorities and the Department of Housing have oversight responsibility. So they need to be doing something that allows them to stand over the fact that these products are being introduced into the marketplace and that they're fit for purpose. So, you know, to state that they've no responsibility in that regard, I would challenge.
Right. Okay. Let me see here. Okay. Sorry, I'm just checking here. In the report, a council executive said that an audit of quarries in Donegal was conducted. Now, was that the audit you were talking about there? This was when the minister asked the Market Surveillance Office in a letter to audit all the quarries in Donegal, and then what happened was there was a committee meeting after that, and Senator Fitzgerald asked, you know, how was this 100% compliance achieved? Because, you know, obviously there's a quarry in Donegal that's, you know, caused a few problems, or maybe even more than one quarry. And yet this audit had 100% compliance. I don't know, have you answered that already, Joe, or is there anything to add to that? Were all the quarries in Donegal tested?
Grant, you probably, if you've seen the audit report, the quarries that were tested were labelled alphabetically, A to whatever, depending on where they fitted in the sequence. So they were anonymised, and that information relative to specific quarries wasn't made available. But going back to my earlier point, I would question the finding of previously undisclosed levels of pyrite as a pass. And there was a subsequent follow-up question to, again, Ms. Mairead Phelan, in terms of specifically Cassidy's quarry, as I understand it, right? I think she was specifically asked, had they tested Cassidy's quarry, and her response was yes, that she actually was there herself on site as that testing was taking place. But she wasn't pushed on it, and she wasn't specific, because I'm aware there's at least two that I'm aware of, quarries that would be locally known as Cassidy's quarries. One of them's in Bungrana, one of them's in Churchill. And, you know, she could have been at both. She might have been at one or the other, and maybe not at one that was of primary interest. But she wasn't pushed, and she didn't clarify it. So look, at the end of the day, the answer is we don't know what quarries they were in. We just have a list of quarries labelled with alphabetic characters with the results there. But to go back to your point, I do not understand how they can stipulate at the end of that they have full compliance when there's previously undisclosed levels of deleterious minerals in Quarry B. I think it was that particular comment was made by the auditors.
You know, that meeting there, I remember, you know, Paddy McLaughlin was kind of asking, you know, quite insistently, was the quarry, you know, he just used the term the quarry, was that the quarry tested? And after a long while of, you know, nothing answers, eventually, I think it was Richard Butler said that, or was it Owen McGrath from GSI? But anyway, they said that it was the quarry that Patrick McLaughlin was talking about was not the one in question. I'll have to go back and get that video out and post it again on Backstory.ie. I'll do that tomorrow, or as soon as I can, and because my recollection of it isn't so good. It'd be better just to post it. Okay, so we have a couple of questions from the audience. So if people do want to send in questions, it's easier for me to get them on Facebook. Twitter's a bit more difficult for me. So if you can put your questions in Facebook, it's easier for them to come through, and hopefully we can ask one or two of them later on. The EU report stated that a council engineer explained that this market surveillance business is highly technical work, and local authorities do not have the expertise and the resources necessary to inspect every manufacturer. What are your thoughts on that, Joe?
I'd absolutely agree, Grant. I think they're spot on. If you look at the level of coordination across multiple state bodies to make that 2022 audit happen, they brought in a lot of very specific expertise from GSA, from the NSAI. There was a lot of highly expert individuals from different bodies involved in that audit to make it happen. So yeah, I'd agree, and I'll be challenged on this maybe, but I think there's only one individual within Donegal County Council specifically with a market surveillance remit, and I'm not sure if it's their only remit, but that was I believe that is the case. So if you look at the level of effort that's involved in terms of going in and assessing quarries, it's not straightforward. It's certainly not the job of one individual. And it does take a lot of coordination across different bodies with different levels of expertise. So yeah, look, I'd agree. I think it's highly complex, and it needs to be resourced a lot better. I mean, Mairead Phelan herself, when she was on prime time, I think she had six staff in the National Building Control Office at the time, and she was asked, "Is that enough to oversee the 200 plus pits and quarries in the country?" And she just simply said, "No, it wasn't." So that probably answers that question.
I think there's nearly 180 quarries or something in Donegal. There's a lot of quarries, but just before we go on to that point, though, the same engineer then said they cannot be on the line of production every day. But the thing is, at the concrete conference that Paul Dunlop organized in November 2022, I got to speak briefly with the concrete expert, one of the concrete experts from Canada, Miss Professor Jose Duchesne, or Duchesne, I don't know how to pronounce it, but she's from Quebec, Laval University. And I asked her, what kind of money is required to test for total sulfur, which, as most of us know now, total sulfur reading of more than 0.1% indicates that you've probably got too much pyrites in your material. And she said there's a company, you can look it up, it's called LECO, LECO, and they have this machine, and it looks like a big coffee machine. And basically, you have to crush the material. You get like an industrial pestle and mortar, crush it, and then you put it in this machine. The machine burns the material at like 2,000 degrees centigrade, and that emits gases. And those gases can then be measured, and then you find the total sulfur. Now that machine actually only costs, I thought it was going to cost millions, but apparently it only costs about 35,000 euros. And in most quarries, I'm sure the amount of money they're dealing with is in the millions. So I mean, to me, I don't see why a single person, in each economic operator can't be tasked and educated enough to do that testing. Because for even if the guy doesn't have the expertise and the knowledge of gases and all the rest of it, they can just go through the motions and get the reading coming out of the machine, And then if something's, and they could do that on a daily basis, because apparently it's like 50 euros a pop to actually carry out each test. So I was kind of gobsmacked at that. Now, obviously, if there was an issue, then a more complex investigation would need to take place, and all the experts from the likes of Geological Surveys Ireland and so on would need to come in. But I don't know. I just thought that they possibly could be something to be done like that, perhaps. Now I may have it all wrong, but it was just something that kind of came to mind. I don't know if you had any thoughts on that, or I mean, you probably weren't aware of that machine, but
I wasn't. And look, and I don't. I'm not. I certainly am. I'm no expert in terms of what it takes to assess quarries. But I'm just pointing back to the exercise in Donegal in 2022. Like, that was a multi body exercise to make that happen. So you have to assume it is a complex exercise in terms of market surveillance oversight. Maybe it's less complex for an economic operator to do something themselves, but in terms of that oversight process, that is the responsibility of local authorities and Department of Housing. In terms of the different expertise that you need, like, across standards, the Standards Authority, GSA in terms of geology, I would suggest it probably is a little more complex maybe than you're suggesting.
Right. Well, I don't know. I'll need to investigate that further. But just on the in this EU petitions report, in terms of the numbers of economic operators that they have to review, this is a quote. The report says that the Market Surveillance Office identified, quote, 450 economic operators that were producing concrete aggregates. She stated that in 2021, they visited and inspected all of them, took samples and performed tests. It was explained that there are currently 300 because many left the industry or stopped producing blocks for construction, unquote. So what kind of intrigued me there, Joe, and I wonder just what your thoughts are. But when the it seems that when the Market Surveillance Office went out to inspect all these 450 economic operators, there are only 300 left, and a bunch of them left. It almost sounded like the statement says the Market Surveillance Office stated that in 2021 they visited and inspected all of them, took samples and performed tests. And the Market Surveillance Office explained that there are currently 300 because many left the industry or stopped producing blocks for construction. So that begs the question, why did they leave? And what comes to my mind is maybe their blocks were no good.
I have no idea, Grant. I'd be speculating, to be quite frank with you. I don't know.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I'm speculating too, but it's just it's just a fact, though. But even so, 300 economic operators to deal with is quite significant. Now, you made reference there, I think, to the small number of staff that the Market Surveillance Office has. At that committee that I was talking about earlier, the Housing Committee, God, I think it was December. Was it December 20? I know it was December. I can't remember if it was 21 and 22. But Miss Richard Butler in the Market Surveillance Office was pressed for how many people work there, and eventually he said there were 6. So there were 6 people to deal with 300 economic operators. And now the latest information that I have is in a Public Accounts Committee not so long ago. There was some correspondence sent to the committee after the meeting that indicated there were now 12 people working in this Market Surveillance Office. And one of the questions that Brian Stanley, from the chair of the Public Accounts Committee, he put in a question saying, how many fines have been issued by the Market Surveillance Office? And what came back from that was that it's not the Market Surveillance Office's remit to issue fines. The Market Surveillance Office can refer an economic operator to the minister, and then the minister is in a position to either impose some jail time, can't remember how much now, or a fine of €500,000. But Joe, could I ask you to guess something? Do you know how many of those items, how many reprimands like that have been made, Joe? Do you know?
All right, so I'm
Could you
guessing,
guess?
right? 0.
0 is correct. So that was also kind of interesting, I thought. Okay, so there was an engineer in the report, not a not to do with the government. It was more an engineer on the expert side of things, and he said, "Quotes: There are 7 sources where the defective blocks come from, and that independent tests found that sulfur present in the aggregates from these quarries exceeds by far the maximum percentage allowed." And the same engineer said, quotes, that he does not have confidence in the quarry audits conducted, unquote. Now, the report states that Ms. Dolores Montserrat, the chair of the Petitions Committee in Europe, asked, quote, how can we make sure that this will never happen again? And how can we help affected families? How can one be certain that products carrying the EC mark comply with the standards, unquote? In light of those quotes, Joe, what has to happen, do you think, for the market surveillance office to be effective? What do we need? What do they need to do?
Well, I mean, going back to the report in terms of the EU Parliament's recommendation, I mean, it's black and white. They've themselves suggested that there needs to be regular assessment of the quarries, and I think that's primary. And I think that capability to be able to do that with the right level of technical expertise that is required to do that, rather than having to reach out to multiple different state bodies, and because that is unwieldy and it takes time to manage across groups. The idea of the National Building Control Office was to provide a centralized service. So that those capabilities that exist that are disparate across all of those different state bodies, I think they need to be available to the National Building Control Office at the flick of a switch. And like I said, this needs to be normal procedure whereby senior leadership within that organization can, metaphorically speaking, press a button and the right people with the right skills in order to go in and assess a quarry effectively, and take that full circle in terms of organizing, laboratory assessment, lab assessment, etc. That needs to be a very well-oiled, very succinct process, centrally managed, in my view, within the NBCO.
Right. I got a letter from Miss Kirsten Joyner, who's the head of the DG Grow, which is basically the part of the European Union that deals with the internal market. And she responded to a question I put to her by saying, quote, without preempting any future decisions to act, the Commission stated that it would become active against the Irish authorities if it was proven that they were not ensuring sufficiently effective control of products being placed on the Irish market. That seems like a significant statement. What do you think about that, Joe? By the way, this letter is fully itemized on Backstory.ie if people want to go back and look for it. But what are your thoughts on that statement, Joe? It sounds like a real positive, maybe, for people living in Ireland.
Yeah, I thought so, Grant, and I'm going to give you credit for bringing it to my attention. That particular lady, Lorna, what was her surname again?
Kirsten Joyner.
Kirsten Joyner. She actually was a replacement for the lady that we met along with Mr. Manfred Frooks when myself, Lisa Hone, Dr. Eileen Doherty, Paul Dunop, and Andreas Lehman went to meet the Commission. I think it was it May 2023, 2 maybe. But so she was a replacement, and I know that that response came from yourself following up just in terms of your own journalistic interest. But yeah, it was interesting, and it's it kind of coins the ask that they gave to us as we left. One of the things that the Commission said to us when we left Brussels back in May, pretty sure it was 20, it might have been 2023, actually, it might have been last year. So they told us a few things, right? Because one, and again, credit has to go to Paul Dunlop and Dr. Anders Lehman. That meeting only happened because of the research that they were doing, because Mr. Frooks, as you know, is an engineer by trade, and his interest was sparked by that work, and that got us a hearing, if you like. But my interest in going over was to understand what it would take for the Commission to get involved directly and influence both market surveillance in this country, but also, the current parameters of the scheme, which are locking a significant portion of the population that are impacted out. So they said what they said to us was, one, if this is a Northwest regional issue, it's not going to warrant EU attention. So obviously that was important to understand the detail there. Then the second thing they said, look, we need to understand if this is a historic issue or if it's a current issue. And then they also need to understand what you've done previously in terms of administrative engagement at a member state level in Ireland, and what has happened legally. So what I've been doing, and not myself, with significant help, we, in terms of that national ask that they had, so we had to prove to them in terms of putting the complaint together. So when we left that meeting, it was my objective then to engage them directly, as you'd stated in your 15-minute clip at the start. Our next step to engage them directly was to put a formal complaint into them, right? But before we could do that, we had to answer what they told us would need to be in there, and the first one was to nationalise the issue. So we've tested properties as far afield as Wexford, and that particular example came back with 800% total sulfur relative to the EU regulation. So immediately, like if you look at Wexford relative to Donegal, they're at separate corners of the island. In fact, I don't think you can get any further away from Donegal on the island. So that particular report, which we have attached to the complaint, or we have available, because they don't ask you to attach your evidence at point of submission, that has nationalised the issue. So we've plenty of evidence up here in Donegal and Mayo and down the Western Seaboard, but now we have a very significant breach in terms of EU regulation from as far afield as Wexford, right? So that nationalised it. And then in terms of currency, so the currency piece is still ongoing, and I've a couple of active initiatives running at the minute. We're looking at recent bills locally in Donegal, but also further afield. And I'm not going to go into that in too much detail, because we want to close out that exercise before we give any detail in terms of what exactly it is that we're doing. Let me put it that way. So we have submitted the complaint. So the complaint, in terms of that direct engagement with the Commission, that's went in March, and we've referenced all of the data points that we have, and that is extensive. And what struck me actually at the People's Document meeting in the Gateway in Buncrana recently, a lot, broadly speaking, right? Broadly speaking, all of the issues that were called out on that night in terms of shortfalls with the scheme, and the issues that those shortfalls are having for people that are impacted, that can't get access to move on. A lot of those issues are in the EU complaint as well, and backed up with evidence. That's the key, because there's no point in me going to the EU Commission with my opinion, because I am inherently biased, and they would recognise that as a homeowner. So all of the positions that we put to the Commission now in that complaint, they're all backed by, they're all anchored first in EU regulation, but then they're backed up with evidence. And I can go through that if you want, in terms of some of that material that we've provided them with. So to go back to your question, Grant, yeah, that statement is very powerful. And in terms of what she has said, we are responding to that. We've responded to it in full in terms of nationalising the issue, and I have a little bit of work to do in terms of currency, because Paul Dunlop mentioned in the clip that you played at the start, we actually had a report to that meeting from I think it was December 21 or going into 22, which we felt was quite recent, right? But there was an ask to go further than that, and you know, be able to prove to them that blocks that are being manufactured today are still not they still don't meet EU regulations. So we've a little bit of work to do there, which is advanced at this point.
Just before we get there, are a few questions, Joe, and a few statements.
Go ahead.
But just before we get to those, because we're actually over time now by 5 minutes.
Okay.
Just can I kind of just understand? Have I got this right? If I just tell you what I think you've kind of explained. Sure. So the petition was like has kind of put it formally on the European agenda that this issue simply cannot be ignored. And that petition then kind of adds weight to the formal complaints, right? Is that okay?
Yeah. So, Grant, just to try and put the context around it, our objective, and if you like, the party that we've been trying to get attention from, has always been the EU Commission, right? They are, if this is the way I understand it, right? Somebody might challenge me in this, and that's fine. So the two bodies within the EU, you've got the Commission and you've got the Parliament. And broadly speaking, the Commission drafts and propose new legislation, and the Parliament adopts it. Not dissimilar, or at least you could draw some alignment between the Dáil and the Seanad, right? Roughly speaking, right? So you might ask, what have we been doing dealing with the Parliament? So you can't just rock up to the EU Commission and knock the door and expect they're going to open it and you're going to get welcomed in, right? Because they've hundreds of millions of citizens with various different issues. So the EU Parliament is, if you like, a gateway to the Commission, right? And they also act as a filter, if you like, in terms of issues that are deemed to be serious enough in nature that they would require EU Commission intervention. But the Commission is the body that we need attention from, because they are the one that have the authority to infringe our member state, which is Ireland. But the Parliament route is bringing all of the expertise that exists within the Parliament to frame an argument that the EU Commission will listen to. And in terms of the report, you know, not every complaint or petition, I should say, that goes to the Petty Committee gets as far as having a report from a mission, right? And we've managed to get that through hugely through a huge part of the effort of MEP Luke Ming Flanagan and his team. But without that report, the two accounts that exist with the EU Commission is the complaint that I've submitted myself in March, and a complaint that Coleman Legal submitted late last year. And both of those can be justifiably seen to be biased. And that's not to say that the EU Commission wouldn't give them a hearing, but you know, one of them's coming from a homeowner and one of them's coming from a legal body which is representing homeowners. So, you know, there is justifiably some bias in there, because we're trying to meet the objective that we're setting out to achieve. However, that is not the case with the mission report, because when they were here, yes, they met homeowners, yes, they met the scientists, they met academics, and they also met the local authority, and they met the Department of Housing officials. So they have got a very balanced view from various different perspectives as to what is going on in this country at the minute. And they've taken that away and they've penned that report, which I think is a very strong representation of what is going on. So that report now sits proudly on the desk of the EU Commission alongside the two complaints, and that's its strength. And what we would hope now, no guarantee, right? None of these threads of the campaign or offer any guarantee, but what we would hope, now that we have the two complaints in, which we feel are robust, along with a very balanced and independent non-national view of what's happening, that will be compelling, and that it will compel the Commission to get involved directly. And what will happen and what that looks like, I'm not sure yet. I have been in constant contact with Luke and his team, so we have more work to do to try and, you know, influence that discussion, if you like.
And just very briefly, Joe, because like I said, we are over time, but you've actually been you're after getting concrete blocks from Wexford, and you've sent them over to a lab somewhere to test them, Is that something you've been doing under your own, your own resources financially and stuff, or?
No, I have to give a great deal of thanks there to the Make Action Group, who have been helping and supporting that effort. And look, we've had some engineers involved that are being very generous with their time, but predominantly in terms of the funding, and it's not cheap, right? You're talking thousands of euro. So we have to be. We're not just going after any properties, right? We're looking at properties that we know are being built or in the process of being built from quarries of concern, right? Let me just leave it at that. Nationally, and this is not just Donegal, right? And Lisa Home has been very generous in terms of supporting us with that regard from a financial perspective.
Great. Okay. Well, I want to thank you very much, Joe, for your participation here today. Just a few comments here. No Flower on Facebook has said it sounds more and more like the post office scandal with each new input, which seems to be a fair statement. If anybody's watched the last 3 committee meetings, 2 finance committee meetings and 1 housing committee meeting, they're on Backstory.ie on YouTube. And you'll find them in the Facebook as well. Those videos are quite remarkable in what was said. Enda Craig has said here, did market surveillance not become reactive rather than proactive? I don't know that it was ever proactive. I don't know. Do you have any insight into that, Joe? Did it change from a proactive exercise to a reactive, or was it just reactive all the time?
Well, we're 15, 20 years into a concrete block crisis, Grant. So, if there was any element of market surveillance over that period of time that was proactive, I don't think we'd be where we are today.
Right. Okay. Now, Mary Connors on Facebook has sent in a bit of a lengthy statement here. Let me read it out. The idea that the public is not informed when quarries aren't compliant is outrageous. Many EU farm grants under the Minister of Agriculture mandate specific items. Oh, there we are. You can see it on the screen there. Many farm grants under the Minister of Agriculture mandate specific items such as manhole covers must be used. They list the companies that make these items, in essence, advertising products for companies. It seems the responsibility of the government to warn the public about non-compliant products immediately. It seems the responsibility of the government is to warn the public about non-compliant products immediately. So yeah, the idea that the public is not informed when quarries aren't compliant is outrageous. I don't know. I would feel outraged if it was my house that was crumbling, and and I could have known that quarry had problems going back some time, and I could have bought my blocks from a different place. I mean, I feel that's cause for outrage.
Yeah, and look, that's the whole reason that we've gone to Europe, Grant. I have to have hope that with the pressures that the national campaign groups are putting on government, the pressures that are coming from the legal initiative, the pressure hopefully that'll come from Europe, and more recently the judicial review that's been kicked off by another group. You have to hope that as a result of all of that market surveillance in this country, particularly around construction products, because they're so expensive, but not just from a financial perspective, from a mental health perspective as well. When they go wrong, you have to hope that there's going to be a bit of a U-turn in terms of what's happening, what it has, and what I believe is still happening in this country today.
Yeah, it's not like if your teddy bear goes wrong, or it suddenly is revealed that a child could swallow the teddy bear's eye or something and become seriously ill, and that product can be withdrawn. But it's very difficult to withdraw a concrete block that's making up a wall. On that, Joe, we'll have to leave it because we run out of time. If you wouldn't mind,
can I just
go ahead.
Close with I just want to offer credits, because I don't want to sit here and feel like that I'm stating that I'm doing all this myself, because I am absolutely not. And I've mentioned a couple of key stakeholders, but I want to make sure that I cover off a couple of others. So one, to Professor Paul Dunlop and Andreas Lehmann for just, getting us in the door to the EU Commission, if you like. They definitely deserve a lot of credit. And even in terms of the complaint that we have put in, like I'm certainly not a professor in geology, and I'm not a concrete scientist. So, Paul Dunlop would have pretty much ripped apart anything that I put in there as a first draft in terms of, the science, and penned that himself. There's also another piece equally important, which I pulled a lot of data from in terms of a paper that was, I think it was published, it was an academic paper published last year by Dr. Eileen Doherty, but that particular paper did a very deep dive in terms of a comparative between the pyrite scandal in Leinster, the lessons learned from that, and the fact that they were not implemented ahead of the concrete crisis happening in Donegal. And that was key evidence in terms of flagging to the Commission the lack of adherence to EU market surveillance regulation, not the predetermined market surveillance, but the response strategy, because there were so many opportunities there to avoid, or at least significantly reduce the timeline in terms of what's going on in relation to defective concrete at the minute. And again, a nod to Lisa Holm for the support from MAG in terms of finance and the testing that we're doing. And lastly, but certainly not least, a big ask from the Commission when we left them in May was we needed to give them proof that we had engaged locally and nationally in terms of an administrative campaign to try and make change happen in this country. My jaw fell when they asked me that, because I knew it was going to be a big ask. And then Miss Debbie McCoy came out with her Ireland on the Precipice, which basically ticked that box for me, so I had nothing to do. So that document is also attached to the complaint as well, and really goes to town in terms of the level of engagement that's happened in this country over the last 15-20 years. So hopefully I haven't forgotten anybody with that.
All right. Well, thanks again, Joe, for coming on the Upset and Concrete podcast. As I explained earlier on, it's a bit sporadic at the moment, but as my skills improve, and with the technology, it'll become more often. It was just a little quote coming in from Roisin Gallagher here, saying that she's optimistic that the supports mentioned in the report will help the homeowners hub become a reality. So fingers crossed that may happen. All right. So once again, Joe, thanks a million for taking part and for giving us your time. And thanks for everybody who tuned in. And if you found this interesting, please share the recorded stream so that other people might get to see it. If it has value, please share it. All right. So Joe, if you wouldn't mind just hanging on for a few minutes when I end the stream. All right. Thanks again, everybody. Take care. Okay. Good night now.